Now, you have probably met with such requests if you're a seasoned IT outsourcing provider, from strangers on LinkedIn to your personal acquaintances to ex-coworkers. There are people all around the globe with brilliant ideas who just need to have their MVP done to prove their points to the investors. A short advice from an old lady here: if that is a stranger, that is a no.
I've seen it all before.
If that is someone you somewhat trust, it might be worth considering, but there are terms and conditions to adhere to first. It is an extremely rare scenario that such an arrangement would be to your benefit as an IT outsourcing provider, so I would only go for it depending on certain circumstances and my personal criteria for a successful project, which is somewhat intuitive, I must admit. So firstly, let's consider all pros and cons if you should be jumping into this mess, and at the end of this video I will share some of the real life examples, successful example and case studies when it might actually work, this joint venture thing, which basically means you do all the work for a person who have a brilliant idea that might work or might not. So let's start with potential benefits, and the first one obviously is equity upside. If your startup with whom you're partnering will become successful, your equity share, your stake, could become highly valuable, far exceeding the typical margin you're making as an IT outsourcing provider, the charges you typically make for your regular margin. The second one is stronger partnership, and what I mean here, if you partner up with a startup at the very early stages when it basically doesn't exist, plus now you have the equity with the startup, this equity can align your interests with that of a startup, making you a true partner rather than a regular IT vendor. This might lead to long-term opportunities and long-term relationship, which might actually scale as the company grows. Well, you will grow accordingly. And since we started to talk about growth opportunity, if the startup's product gains traction, your early involvement and potential stake could put you in a preferred position as a desirable partner for future tech needs or even a potential buyout offer. Early retirement, it seems to me.
I want to retire.
To be honest, I can't think of any other potential advantages and benefits in such a venture, so let's talk about the risks you might be suffering as an IT outsourcing provider. And the first and obvious one is startup failure, obviously. Most startups don't succeed, so you're taking a gamble by foregoing reliable income. If the company doesn't make it, you've worked without a margin for no return. I mean,
boy, do I feel stupid.
Which is a highly possible scenario because, again, 90% of startups fail. Another risk that you should be bespeaking before you actually start working with them, if you decide to work with them, is valuation and dilution. That basically involves how much equity they are offering for you and at what valuation. If you don't know what that means, Google, because if the startup raises more funds later, your stake could be diluted. So you need to be absolutely sure that the equity terms are solid, and you actually have to have an agreement with them, and we will come to that later. And the third risk is opportunity cost. By working at a reduced rate, obviously you are effectively subsidizing the startup, but you'll need to evaluate whether this diverts resources from the paying clients who might offer more immediate returns. So you should be absolutely sure your opportunity costs is not monstrous and you're not losing like a fortune by working with that potentially beneficial partner. And with view of all these risks, what are the key considerations for you to make as an IT outsourcing provider? And that is the first one I've already mentioned, and that is equity terms. And make sure that the equity offer is fair to you and has a clear path to liquidity, for example, through IPO or an exit. So you should negotiate such things as vesting schedules, anti-dilution clauses, and other legal protections. And again, I will mention all of those a little bit later. And now Now, the third thing you should take into consideration is balance, and that is, if possible, negotiate a hybrid deal, perhaps a smaller reduction on your regular rates, for example, so you still get some revenue, or at least you don't pay out of your pocket to your developers, while also having a stake in their future development. Now, this is extremely important because, as you might know, if you have been on this channel for long enough, you might know that I'm all for play it safe because, I don't like to risk my fortune because of someone else.
Where's my money, Raymond?
Now, as a resume, it could be a good scheme if you believe in the startup and if the equity offer is reasonable, and basically you'd be betting on their long-term success rather than short-term benefits. However, due diligence is crucial here, and you need to structure such a deal properly. Here, I got you covered. You can find the joint venture equity document, which essentially you want to sign with your startup partner, on my Patreon page. The first one you will see when you go to my Patreon. There is a public post with all the tips on how to outline a joint venture agreement yourself. Here it is, available to public. But if you don't want all the hassle, there are 2 templates on joint venture agreements, 2 templates available for download as a one-time buy. So you go to my Patreon and download both of them. And it's available for both my paid patrons and as a one-time buy. Now, a few successful real-life case studies of joint ventures that might actually work and actually worked. And the first case is when you are a tech guru yourself and can contribute to the startup success by providing your time rather than contributing with your money or with your hired resources. A successful example would be my co-founder, who has teamed up with several startups and provided his tech expertise to those startups, and naturally few of them failed, but one has succeeded, and my co-founder has a share in that company now. Another real-life case study of a successful collaboration with a startup as a joint venture would be for you as an IT service provider to lower your rates, like I've already mentioned, and to sell your team like almost flat or with some minor profit to just cover your expenses, on the terms that this startup makes you their major IT vendor, IT outsourcing provider, once they receive their funds and once they succeed. Then you can start charging them with fair prices on fair terms, and this way you don't lose your money at the very least and don't lose your time. You gain expertise, you use your resources who might be probably on bench, but at the same time you don't get much while you work with them and while they get their funding. So let me stress here that this only makes sense if such a collaboration doesn't last longer than, say, 6 months, and only if you have resources available and only if you say we'll have to keep them on bench. Such an arrangement will keep them occupied while at the same time you retain your people, your resources. This is sort of a win-win situation in this case. And this is actually our own case, but I have only considered doing so, meaning going into a joint venture, because I've spoken with the startup founder several times and I've actually liked his idea more than I did everything else I've heard.
God, I've seen it all.
I've explored their team, their potential, their advisors, and their angels. So this was the first and so far the only case when I believed in startup and it didn't fail. But it's a very rare case scenario, so you should have all your ears covered in case you go into such a collaboration, and make sure you don't lose your time and money with them. You, on the other hand, might have a different successful case study depending on your expertise and what you can provide and what you can afford to lose and what you can't. But keep in mind that 90% of startups fail, and if you decide to do a joint venture, make sure your ears are covered, your risks are minimized, and that you are subscribed to Olga's channel, and then you'll be fine. And if you still haven't, grab a template on joint venture agreements on my Patreon, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!